Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conversion of Granny Grumman. In this episode, we'll be completely overhauling the entire brake system. Before removing any of the old components, I'm going to take the new brake master cylinder and bench bleed it. This ensures that no air is introduced to the rest of the system, which we'll have to bleed out later. First up, we're going to add some brand new .3 brake fluid. As the fresh brake fluid enters the master cylinder, we'll see little bubbles coming up. And once those bubbles stop and a little fluid starts to drip out of these holes, we know that the system is primed. Using the provided threaded plastic plugs, we'll cap off the output of the master cylinder, then use a screwdriver to move the piston in about an inch to purge any other air that's left in the system. Now that the new master cylinder is all prepped and ready to go, we can go lay down some rags and then begin removing the old master cylinder. I had hoped that the brake booster would be in a little bit better condition, but I didn't have one on me, so I just worked with what I had by using some sandpaper, cleaning it up with some brake cleaner, and then cleaning it more off camera until I found it to be good enough. It's definitely something I'll keep my eye on, and I'll probably replace it fairly soon. With the new brake master cylinder in place, I can now begin removing the old proportioning valve and then replacing it with a brand new one. A proportioning valve has several functions. It ensures that 80% of the braking pressure is sent to the front calipers and 20% are sent to the rear shoes in an emergency braking situation, ensuring that you don't fishtail. Also, if the rear shoes are severely worn or out of adjustment, a red brake light will come on the dash when you apply pressure. And if the front or the rear system has a severe leak, it'll send all braking to the front or the rear. When bleeding the system, you need to remove the switch from the proportioning valve, then put in this black locking tool so the piston doesn't move as it normally would during regular function. If you were to try to bleed the system without this tool, the piston would continually lock the front or the rear system, whichever one has the most air in it, and then you would never get all the air bubbles out. With the new brake master cylinder and proportioning valve installed, we can begin replacing the left front brake hose, brake caliper, brake pads, rotor, wheel bearings, and seal. Whenever I jack up a vehicle, I always use a jack stand and a jack, then I kick the living crap out of it to make sure it's not going to go anywhere. I also push the wheel under the frame as a Hail Mary protection in case the worst happens. Before putting the new hose and caliper on, I wanted to try bleeding the system in case there was any contaminated fluid. That way I'm not pushing it right into the new caliper. But unfortunately, the old brake bleed nipple was just too far gone and ended up rounding off quite quickly. So unfortunately, I'd just have to replace the line and the caliper and hope there was no contaminated fluid upstream. Before removing the old brake line and caliper, I wanted to get the new caliper and brake line prepped and ready to go. As soon as I remove the old brake line, fluid's going to start pulling from the new brake master cylinder, and if enough leaks out, it could introduce air into the system, and that's the last thing I want. The steel brake line goes through the frame right here to connect to the rubber brake line that connects to the caliper, so it's a very cumbersome and very annoying line to replace. The old brake pads had worn down to the rivets, putting that big groove in the rotor, and the caliper was frozen, which is why it was so hard to get off. With the old caliper out of the way, I can now gently stage the new one and get the line right next to the old one, so when I swap them, it's a quick and easy process, losing as little fluid as possible. And now I can finally remove the old caliper. Since the new proportioning valve has the locking tool installed, I can open the brake bleed nipple on the brand new caliper and let the fluid just travel through using gravity. As the fluid slowly travels through the system, I'll keep a keen eye for any small or large bubbles, and when I see no more, I'll go ahead and tighten up the brake bleed nipple and remove the hose. With the new brake caliper staged and ready to go, I can gently place it out of the way so I can begin removing the old rotor and wheel bearings. Whenever you're installing new parts, it's always a good idea to clean all the old grease, grime, dirt, and crud away from the surface that you're mounting onto. Before installing the new rotor onto the spindle, I'm going to need to pack this bearing with brand new grease, then install the seal behind it using a seal driver. Now that the new rotor is ready to go, I'll go ahead and lube up the spindle just so that there's zero chance of metal-to-metal contact. And now I'll pack and install the outer bearing. Next is the keyed washer. And finally the castle nut. The next step is to tighten up the castle nut as I spin the rotor, then back it off a quarter or half turn. With the rotor set to go, the next step is to put on the brake pads, but I need to clean the surface that the pads will ride on because there's a special protective grease they install at the factory so that the rotors don't rust in transit. With the new pads set to go and a cotter pin installed off camera, the last step is to install the dust cap. With the left front brake system completely overhauled and ready to go, it's time to put the wheel back on and then drop the jack and move to the other side. I won't be showing this because it's the exact same process, but it was in very bad condition. With the front brakes completely overhauled, it's time to move to the rears. One of my least favorite jobs to do are drum brakes, and these ones are even worse than usual, as you have to remove the entire axle to get the drum removed. With the axle out of the way, I can bend this tab on this locking washer so I can remove the outer spindle nut. With the outer spindle nut out of the way, now I can remove the locking washer and then remove the inner spindle nut. And finally, I'll use 2 dental picks to remove the keyed washer so I can finally remove the drum. Did I mention that I hate drum brakes? With the brake drum out of the way, I'll apply a heavy-duty degreaser, then use a power washer to remove any of the dust that is mixed with the brake fluid that was leaking out of the failed wheel cylinder. Before continuing any further, I want to make sure that I'm going to be able to break free all the steel lines from the rubber line that I'm going to be replacing, as well as the wheel cylinders. The last thing I want is to not be able to park the van back in the garage. And luckily they all broke free so I can continue on. The old proportioning valve was locked, which would always illuminate a red brake light on the dash. I believe this is because both the wheel cylinders had leaks, and they had had leaks for so long that the proportioning valve had frozen in place. I use my phone to film my videos, and even I get pretty turned around when it comes to drum brakes, so instead of filming it, I was watching a video by Chris Fix that I'll provide a link for. With the new shoes, springs, and everything ready to go, I can take the old drum, apply a heavy degreasing agent, and remove any residue with a power washer. I forgot to get new seals for the rear, but using my finger, it felt soft enough to reuse it. This is another example of working with what I got, but it's something to definitely keep an eye on and replace down the line. These bearings are usually lubricated by the gear oil in the rear end, but I'm gonna apply some grease just so that it doesn't have metal-to-metal contact when I first start it up. I ended up taking a burrito brake and going to O'Reilly's to get this specific spindle nut socket. The instructions say to tighten down the spindle nut to 50 foot-pounds while rotating the drum. I couldn't do both at the same time, so I did one after the other multiple times. After that, you back the nut off and then do the same thing but to 30 foot-pounds. With the drum installed and the locking washer and outer nut installed, I can clean the surface that the axle mates to and then reinstall it. Again, you're supposed to install a new gasket, but this gasket looked good enough and we'll just see if it leaks. And if it does, I'll go ahead and replace it. And once I install the wheel, I can go ahead and jack up the other side and begin this process all over again. The last step is to adjust the brake shoes out using the adjuster and a flat blade screwdriver. By spinning the wheel, I'll wait till I feel a very slight tension and then I know they're properly adjusted. With the rear axle supported by 2 jack stands and a jack and having the front wheels chalked off, I can start the van and put it in gear and slowly engage and tap the brakes to make sure that the shoes are properly adjusted. And the last and scariest step is getting the van up to speed and then jamming on the brakes.
Oh, yeah.
And finally, after 8 months of blood, sweat, and tears, I can take Granny Grumman out on the open road. And you'll see me pull over here because I spotted a sheriff in the distance. Granny Grumman has 2 broken windows and no left mirrors, so it's definitely not legal to drive. Granny Grumman's not quite registered yet, so I stood in front of the license plate so the cop wouldn't run it and gave him a friendly wave, and he waved back, and then I got back on my way when he left.
The fuel meter has moved a lot. That's really not good.
With Granny Grumman's first road test being an absolute success, I can drive her back onto my dad's property and park her away. Once I replace the 2 broken windows, the 2 broken mirrors, and find and patch up any leaks that let water into the van, I can finally begin converting the inside of Granny Grumman. Thank you everyone who has watched, who has subscribed, who has supported me throughout this journey. I can't wait to show you what it's going to look like on the inside, and I can't wait to finally move into my big, huge mobile studio and tiny home.